At 10:50 in the morning on June 27, 1950, Lieutenant William Hudson gripped the controls of an aircraft that looked like it belonged in a sideshow. He circled above Kimpo Airfield in South Korea, looking down at chaos that could turn into slaughter at any second. He was not flying a jet. He was not sitting in one of the sleek P-80 shooting stars the Air Force bragged about. Instead, he was strapped into an F-82 twin Mustang, a machine that looked like an engineering accident. 2 fuselages, 2 tails, 2 separate cockpits, all connected by one long wing. To the new generation of jet pilots, Hudson might as well have been driving farm equipment onto a racetrack. But at that moment, that awkward piston-driven aircraft was the only shield protecting hundreds of American civilians from execution. Below him, Kimpo was running on nerves and discipline. C-54 Skymaster transports lined the runway nose to tail, engines turning, waiting to take on diplomats, families, and children fleeing the North Korean advance. The air carried the smell of oil, hot metal, and fear. The enemy army was closing from the ground. Their air force was already hunting. Soviet-built Yak fighters cruised through the sky looking for something slow and helpless. A loaded C-54 was not a combat target. It was an easy prize. Large, slow, and unarmed. If those transports lifted off without fighter cover, they would not make it to the coast. Hudson understood exactly how fragile the situation was. American officers on the ground were shouting into radios, demanding protection overhead. They needed fighters to clear the sky. What they lacked was not courage or weapons. It was distance. The closest American bases were in Japan, more than 300 miles away across the Sea of Japan. On a map, that did not look extreme. In 1950, it was a logistical nightmare. For 5 years, the United States Air Force had obsessed over jet engines. They had built squadrons of P-80 shooting stars. Fast, modern, clean lines. They looked like the future. But they had a weakness that could not be ignored. Early jet engines devoured fuel. They consumed it relentlessly, like men on shore leave draining bottles without pause. A P-80 departing Japan would burn enormous amounts of fuel just climbing and crossing open water. By the time it reached Kimpo, the pilot would glance at his gauges and see the needle drifting toward empty. He would have perhaps 15 or 20 minutes to actually patrol or fight before he had to turn back. Stay a minute too long, and you would not reach land again. Pilots called that moment bingo fuel. It was when the numbers made the decision for you. Hudson watched the P-80s arrive with noise and speed, looking untouchable. For a short time, their presence forced the North Koreans to hesitate. Then, one after another, the jets peeled away. Inside their cockpits, the pilots were swearing as warning lights flickered. They had no choice. Their engines were starving. The transports below were left exposed as the silver jets streaked back toward the sea. On the ground, refugees watched the fighters disappear. The sky grew quiet again. The Yak pilots saw it too. They rolled their wings and turned back toward the transports. That was when Hudson and the other twin Mustangs took over. They were not racing against empty tanks. They had crossed from Japan and still had time to spare. They could circle Kimpo for hours. They could engage repeatedly and still have enough fuel to return. While the jets were chained to their consumption rates, the twin Mustang ruled the air by endurance alone. The odd-looking aircraft had arrived to carry the burden. To understand why such a strange fighter existed, you have to return to the Pacific War. In 1943 and 1944, American forces were fighting across distances that defied European experience. The Pacific Ocean was an endless expanse. Missions lasted 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours. B-29 Superfortress bombers flew enormous distances to strike the Japanese mainland. They suffered heavy losses because no fighter could accompany them the entire way. The P-51 Mustang was revolutionary, but even it had limits. A single pilot in a cramped cockpit could only endure so much. 8 hours seated without standing. No room to stretch. The engine vibrating through the airframe. Constant noise. Freezing temperatures at altitude. After 6 hours, mental clarity begins to fade. Fatigue sets in. Reaction times slow. Small mistakes become likely. Meet a Japanese Zero after 7 hours in the air, and exhaustion alone can defeat you. The Air Force needed something different. They required a fighter capable of flying 2,000 miles, fighting, and then flying 2,000 miles home. They turned to North American aviation and asked for an answer that sounded unreasonable. Engineers examined the P-51 and asked a practical question. What if two pilots shared the workload but had separate cockpits? What if endurance came from teamwork? The result was the F-82 twin Mustang. Critics laughed immediately. They called it double trouble. They joked about Siamese twins. Some said it was a marketing stunt to sell two airplanes at once. Others claimed the pilots would argue and try to steer in opposite directions. They were wrong. The F-82 was not two fighters crudely bolted together. It was an entirely new aircraft built around a proven foundation, carrying the bloodline of the Mustang, but engineered for stamina, range, and sustained combat. The real breakthrough was simple. On long missions, the workload was divided. The pilot in the left cockpit, the position Hudson occupied now, would handle the aircraft for the first 4 hours. The man in the right cockpit was not there for decoration. He had a complete set of controls in front of him. He could fly the airplane just as well. But he also had something no single-seat fighter pilot ever had. His seat could recline. He could disconnect his controls, lean back, and sleep. He could read. He could eat. He could let his mind reset instead of fighting exhaustion. Halfway to the objective, they would switch. The rested pilot would take over. The one who had been flying would stretch out and close his eyes. By the time the twin Mustang reached Tokyo, or years later Korean airspace, the man holding the stick was alert, steady, and fully functional. It was essentially a dormitory with 650 caliber machine guns mounted in its wing. Then the jet age arrived, and suddenly the twin Mustang looked outdated. It still had propellers and a service that worshipped turbines. It was heavier and slower than the sleek new fighters. The Air Force tried to retire it quietly. They shoved it aside, embarrassed by the spinning blades and unusual shape. The future was supposed to roar on jet exhaust, not piston engines. But war has a habit of exposing fashion as weakness. When North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel, the future did not perform as advertised. The jets needed forward bases that did not exist. Speed alone meant nothing without endurance. What the war demanded was time in the air. It needed a fighter that could stay overhead like a guard dog. That is why, on that tense morning at Kimpo, civilians did not see a shining silver dart above them. They saw the twin Mustang. Hudson glanced at the Yak fighters below, then at his fuel gauge. The needle barely shifted. He had margin. He had options. He advanced the throttle. Both Merlin engines answered together, not with a scream, but with a deep, rolling thunder. The F-82 did not glide like a dancer. It felt solid, heavy, and deliberate. It was built to absorb punishment. Hudson aligned his sights on the leading Yak. He did not realize he was seconds away from recording the first aerial victory of the Korean War, and he would achieve it in an aircraft many had dismissed as obsolete. The jets had withdrawn. The propeller fighter remained. The Yak pilot spotted the strange twin fuselages diving toward him and hauled the stick into a hard turn. He assumed he was facing something closer to a bomber than a fighter. He expected sluggish response. He misjudged it completely. To understand why Hudson could sit comfortably over a battlefield while advanced jets were forced to retreat, you have to examine the machine itself. The F-82 may have been the greatest visual deception in aviation. At a glance, even to experienced pilots, it appeared improvised. It looked as though North American aviation had leftover P-51 fuselages from the Second World War and welded them together to save money. Detractors labeled it a Frankenstein creation, a stitched relic from a bygone conflict. That impression was false. The F-82 was not two outdated fighters fused together. It was purpose-built for a very specific problem. Engineers had learned that in long-range warfare, the greatest enemy was not always foreign aircraft. It was human physiology. It was the bladder that could not wait. It was the spine compressed for hours. It was the mental strain of sitting inside a vibrating metal shell for half a day. You could design an aircraft that stayed airborne indefinitely, but the pilot would collapse before landing. The single-seat P-51 Mustang was a superb machine, yet after 8 hours it felt like confinement. The F-82 addressed that biological limitation directly. It was the first fighter designed with the understanding that the human body was the weak link. The cockpit arrangement made the difference. In a conventional fighter, a pilot is strapped in tight, unable to move. In the twin Mustang, The cockpit functioned more like a workspace. The left seat pilot flew the mission, managed navigation, and engaged the enemy. The right seat pilot was not cargo. He was equally trained and fully equipped. When fatigue set in, control passed smoothly from one cockpit to the other. No stimulants. No desperate attempts to stay awake. Just a transfer of responsibility. Most important, the seats reclined completely. A pilot could hand off the controls, disengage his pedals, and sleep. Crews called it a flying dormitory because they could remain effective even after 14-hour flights. That range transformed the Pacific from an obstacle into manageable distance. The Air Force proved it before Korea erupted. 3 years earlier, they launched a twin Mustang named Betty Jo from Honolulu. Fully fueled, it climbed out and turned east. It did not stop until New York City appeared ahead. 5,000 miles in 14 hours and 32 minutes. No refueling. No landing. Contemporary jet fighters would have required multiple stops to match that distance. When Betty Jo touched down, the pilot stepped out looking composed, as though he had just completed a routine trip. The demonstration carried strategic implications. It showed that an escort fighter could depart Alaska, reach Moscow, fight, and return. Back over Kimpo in 1950, Hudson was not thinking about endurance records. He was calculating lead and closure rates. The Yak-9 pilot had made an assumption that would cost him. He saw the large, unconventional American aircraft and believed it handled like a transport. He believed he could outturn it. He equated weight with sluggishness. He was wrong. The Yak pilot rolled sharply, intent on lining up the defenseless transports. He barely acknowledged the strange twin-bodied fighter dropping toward him. To him, the F-82 looked awkward, almost comical. He had no idea what was about to hit him. Unlike the P-51, which carried its guns in the wings and required careful convergence settings, the F-82 mounted all 650 caliber machine guns in the center wing section. There was no narrow sweet spot where the streams met. The guns were aligned straight ahead. They fired in parallel. Because both fuselages were joined by a broad central wing, engineers packed the 6 guns tightly along the aircraft's centerline. They did not angle inward. They did not depend on geometry. They sent a straight, unified stream forward. It was not a spreading cone. It was a dense column of metal. At 50 yards or 500, it made no difference. If the sight rested on the target and the trigger was pulled, the full weight of the battery struck. Hudson eased back on the stick. Despite its size, the twin Mustang responded cleanly. 2 engines meant enormous power. The aircraft did not drift through the turn. It drove through it. He centered the Yak in his gun sight. The North Korean pilot realized too late that he had misjudged the situation. He tried to dive away, but the American fighter was already in position. Hudson did not fire a warning burst. He pressed the trigger. All 6 machine guns erupted at once. The cockpit shook as the recoil traveled through the airframe. The sound was not a series of shots, but a continuous, heavy roar, like machinery hammering steel. Tracer rounds streaked forward from the center of the wing in a tight, burning line. The effect was immediate. Because the rounds were concentrated, they did not simply puncture the Yak. They tore through it. The aluminum skin shredded. The wing spar splintered under the impact. The canopy shattered. The aircraft came apart in seconds. One moment it was a fighter. The next it was debris and flame. The right wing separated and spun away. The fuselage broke, folding into itself. There was no time to escape. The wreckage spiraled downward toward the fields below, trailing thick black smoke. Hudson pulled up hard. Gravity pressed him into his seat. Over the intercom, Lieutenant Fraser shouted confirmation. They had just recorded the first aerial victory of the Korean War. It had not been achieved by a jet or by a missile. It had been scored by a propeller-driven aircraft many had written off as outdated. Below, the C-54 transports lifted heavily from the runway, packed with civilians. They climbed out of the valley unharmed. The remaining Yaks scattered. They had witnessed what the double fuselage fighter could do and wanted no part of it. The message was clear. The departure of the jets did not mean the sky was undefended. But the campaign did not pause. On the ground, the situation deteriorated. North Korean forces advanced with T-34 tanks, pushing south and breaking through shaken South Korean lines. Then the weather turned. Monsoon season settled over the peninsula. Dark clouds rolled in. Rain fell in sheets. Ceiling heights dropped to 500 feet, pressing against the mountains. For the jets, it was crippling. The P-80 shooting stars depended on visual targeting. They needed clear sightlines to attack. They lacked advanced radar. They did not have the fuel to weave under low cloud cover searching for armor in narrow valleys. When the clouds closed, the jets stayed grounded. They sat idle on runways in Japan, gleaming and ineffective. Commanders studied weather reports with frustration. They possessed the most modern air force on Earth, yet rain had neutralized it. The twin Mustang offered something different. The large pod beneath its center wing was not simply extra fuel. It housed radar equipment. The man in the right cockpit was not only a relief pilot. He served as a radar intercept officer. The F-82 was built for all-weather operations. It did not depend on clear skies. It could operate in darkness and cloud. While jets remained on the tarmac, twin Mustangs launched into the storm. They flew with limited visibility, guided by the glow of radar screens. They descended into valleys between mountain ridges as rain lashed the canopy. Using radar returns, they located North Korean convoys moving beneath the cloud cover and released bombs on vehicles that believed themselves hidden. They became unseen hunters in the mountains. Soldiers on the ground began to recognize the sound of the paired engines. A low rumble above the clouds was often followed by explosions without warning. Twin Mustang crews flew mission after mission. Fatigue set in, but they continued because alternatives were scarce. Whenever defensive lines threatened to collapse, requests came for the aircraft with the double tails. The enemy observed carefully. They understood that American forces depended heavily on this specific fighter. They recognized that the jets were fast, but limited by range. They also recognized that the twin Mustangs, though durable, were not fast machines. The North Koreans adjusted quickly. Intelligence summaries began to mention changes at the front. Additional anti-aircraft batteries were being positioned along key routes. But that was not the real concern. There were whispers of something else. Moscow was observing closely. The Soviets had noticed how effectively the twin Mustangs operated at night and in poor weather. They decided to introduce a new variable. Near the Yalu River, along the border between North Korea and China, American radar stations began detecting unfamiliar returns. These were not slow piston-driven fighters. The contacts were moving at extraordinary speed. They climbed at rates that defied expectation. Radar operators watched as the blips swept across their scopes at 600 miles per hour. They recalibrated their equipment, suspecting malfunction. Nothing in the region should have been capable of that performance. During the opening weeks of the war, the twin Mustangs had controlled the sky. They had protected evacuations. They had broken up armored thrusts. They had embarrassed critics who dismissed them. But that period of dominance was ending. Technology was catching up. The F-82 was durable and reliable. Yet it was about to face an opponent built for a different era. Hudson and his squadron were flying a patrol near the front when the radio call came through. A large formation of enemy aircraft was heading south. The controller's voice lacked its usual steadiness. Static cracked over the frequency. Be advised. Bogies are high and fast. Repeat, very fast. They are not yaks. Hudson scanned the sky. The rain had cleared, leaving sharp blue above. It was ideal flying weather. He checked his ammunition. He checked his fuel reserves. He glanced toward Fraser in the right cockpit. They had been fighting manageable opponents. Now something new was entering the conflict. The unconventional fighter had proven its endurance. Now it would be tested against speed. By August 1950, the war had shifted from retreat to containment. United Nations forces were compressed into a small defensive zone at the southeastern edge of the peninsula, known as the Pusan Perimeter. The defensive area stretched roughly 50 miles across and 80 miles deep. Behind them was the sea. Ahead of them, North Korean forces pressed relentlessly. It was no longer a fluid campaign. It was sustained combat. T-34 tanks crowded narrow valleys. Infantry filled the hills. American commanders scrambled to reinforce weak sectors as breaches opened along the line. Every gap they sealed was replaced by another several miles away. Units were exhausted. Ammunition stocks ran thin. Reinforcements were limited. Air support was essential, and it was needed immediately. Yet the logistical problem remained. Airfields inside the perimeter were overcrowded and vulnerable. The bulk of air power still launched from Japan, constrained by distance. The jet fighters arrived at high speed, delivered a limited strike, and then departed to preserve fuel. Ground troops watched them approach with relief and watched them depart with frustration. A column of armor does not pause simply because aircraft withdraw. North Korean forces adapted. They observed the pattern. They waited until the jets turned back across the water, then advanced. They referred to that interval as killing time. One aircraft type did not operate on that schedule. The F-82 twin Mustang became a constant presence over the Pusan Perimeter. Pilots from the 68th and 339th Fighter Squadrons endured missions that stretched human limits. Flights lasted 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours. They departed Japan, crossed open water, and remained overhead for extended periods, circling above the battlefield. Hudson and Fraser were deeply involved in these operations. One humid Tuesday night, an urgent report came through. A substantial North Korean armored column was advancing through a narrow valley near the Naktong River. The target was a vulnerable sector held by an understrength infantry company. If the tanks penetrated, supply routes would be severed and the defensive line could unravel. Weather conditions were poor. Low clouds, fog, and steady rain. Jet aircraft were grounded. Single-engine fighters lacked visibility. The twin Mustang, however, was equipped for such conditions. Hudson approached the valley at 3,000 feet. He could not see the terrain clearly through the canopy, but visual contact was not required. Fraser focused on the radar display. The large pod beneath the center wing emitted pulses that penetrated rain and cloud cover. On the glowing green scope, the shape of the valley appeared. Mountain ridges formed solid returns. Open areas showed differently. They began searching for movement. On Fraser's radar screen, the valley took shape in green light. The river curved through it like a dark ribbon. Then came the bright returns. Hard, sharp dots. Metal reflects radar far better than Earth. The tanks stood out clearly, clustered along the road. The entire column glowed on the scope. Hudson pushed the nose down. The heavy fighter slid through rain and darkness, picking up speed as it descended. This was the part that demanded absolute trust. He could not see the terrain clearly. He had to rely on the voice in his headset. Right 3 degrees. Descend to 1,000. Target 2 miles. Fraser fed him headings and altitude corrections while watching the scope. Hudson drove the aircraft into what looked like a black void at 300 miles per hour, trusting that a mountain would not suddenly appear in front of him. They broke out of the cloud layer at 800 feet. The valley floor came into view as a blurred gray expanse. Below, the T-34 tanks rolled along a muddy road, convinced the weather shielded them from air attack. It did not. Hudson armed his rockets. The F-82 carried high-velocity aircraft rockets, known to the crews as Holy Moses. Each one was 5 inches thick, a solid cylinder of explosive power. They were not guided. Accuracy depended entirely on aim. He lined up on the lead tank and pressed the firing switch. 2 rockets streaked away from the rails, trailing white smoke. They crossed the distance in seconds and struck the first tank head-on. The explosion lit the valley. The 30-ton vehicle did not simply stop. It flipped. The turret separated and tumbled aside. Flames engulfed the wreckage. The destroyed tank blocked the narrow road, trapping every vehicle behind it. The column was sealed in place. Hudson pulled up sharply, engines roaring as tracer fire rose from below. He did not turn toward home. He banked around for another pass. 23 rockets remained. Thousands of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition were still available. The trapped tank crews had nowhere to go. The burning wreck prevented forward movement. The narrow road prevented turning around. They were confined targets in a confined space. For 45 minutes, Hudson and the other twin Mustangs in his flight worked the valley methodically. They established a racetrack pattern. As one aircraft pulled off after an attack, another was already diving in. The process was continuous. The deep pulse of the twin engines echoed against the valley walls. Rockets cracked. Machine guns tore through metal and earth. North Korean gunners fired back, but they were outmatched. The F-82 also carried an additional option, a belly-mounted gun pod that added 8 more .50 caliber machine guns to the existing 6. When all 14 were fired simultaneously, the recoil was immense. The aircraft seemed to hesitate midair under the force. The stream of fire shredded vehicles, splintered trees, and tore apart supply trucks. On his 10th attack run, Hudson encountered serious trouble. He was strafing a truck near the rear of the column when a 37mm anti-aircraft shell struck his left wing. The detonation punched a hole large enough to crawl through. The aircraft jolted violently. The left engine sputtered, coughed smoke, and failed. Oil pressure dropped instantly. Warning lights illuminated the cockpit. In most fighters, this would have meant destruction. A single-engine P-51 losing power at low altitude would crash. A jet losing its engine would not survive. The twin Mustang was different. Hudson wrestled the controls as the damaged aircraft tried to roll toward the dead engine. Drag from the ruined wing and windmilling propeller was severe. He shoved the right throttle forward to emergency power. The remaining engine responded with a strained roar. Feathering left, he called. He pulled the propeller control for the failed engine. The blades rotated, presenting their narrow edges to the airflow. The left propeller slowed and stopped, reducing drag. The left fuselage was now dead weight. The right fuselage carried the fight. The aircraft trembled, but it stabilized. Slowly, it began to climb. It was not elegant. It vibrated heavily, but it flew. The design allowed single-engine operation. Even limited climbing, provided the pilot avoided aggressive maneuvers. Hudson guided the crippled aircraft out of the valley, leaving the burning convoy behind. The ordeal was not finished. They were still 300 miles from Japan, operating on one engine. The dual cockpit arrangement proved its value again. In a single-seat fighter, a pilot handling an engine failure must fly, navigate, manage systems, and communicate simultaneously. Overload and panic can follow. Hudson was not alone. Fraser assumed navigation duties and handled radio traffic. He calculated fuel consumption on one engine and identified the nearest emergency field in Japan. He coordinated with ground crews. Hudson concentrated on maintaining control and keeping the aircraft steady in the air. They functioned as a unit, dividing the mental strain. That cooperation was the difference between survival and a crash into the sea. The return flight was painfully slow. They crept eastward across the Sea of Japan on a single engine. Dawn exposed the damage clearly. The left wing gaped open, torn aluminum curled back like peeled skin. Altitude bled away gradually. They traded height for range. The remaining engine ran far beyond safe limits. Temperature climbing, oil consumption rising. It was working past its red line. It did not fail. The awkward aircraft refused to quit. When the Japanese coastline finally appeared, they were down to 2,000 feet. Itazuke Air Base came into view ahead, the runway looking impossibly short. Hudson lowered the landing gear. The hydraulic system strained audibly. The left gear locked into place. The right hesitated. The wing damage may have severed hydraulic lines. He recycled the handle. No response. They would have to land with one wheel and hope the structure held. Emergency vehicles were already rolling toward the runway. Sirens echoed across the field. Hudson lined up carefully and held the aircraft just above the surface, bleeding off speed. The left tire struck first, rubber screeching against concrete. He worked the rudder aggressively to maintain alignment. As speed decreased, the unsupported right side began to sink. He held it off with aileron as long as possible. Eventually physics won. The right wingtip contacted the runway. Sparks sprayed behind them in a bright arc. The aircraft yawed and skidded sideways before grinding to a stop in dust and smoke. Silence followed. No engine roar. No gunfire. Only the ticking of cooling metal and approaching sirens. Hudson opened his canopy and looked across to Fraser. The radar operator raised a thumb. They were alive. They had destroyed an armored column and brought a crippled aircraft home across open water, while jets remained grounded by weather. Ground crews pulled them from the wreck. Mechanics studied the torn wing and blackened engine in disbelief. "You are fortunate," one of them said. 5 more minutes, and it would have been a glider. Hudson lit a cigarette, hands still unsteady. "It is not fortune," he replied. "It is 2 engines, 2 pilots, and enough fuel." Yet even as twin Mustangs dominated ground support missions, the aerial balance was changing. Reports of high-speed contacts were no longer speculation. While F-82 crews held the Pusan Perimeter, the Soviet Union escalated its involvement. The MiG-15 entered the conflict. The swept-wing jet was faster, climbed more rapidly, and carried heavier armament than any American piston fighter. The propeller era was nearing its end. The twin Mustang had sustained the line. Now it faced an opponent that considered it easy prey. The first appearances of the MiG-15 over Korea shocked American forces. The F-82 was no longer the dominant aircraft. It was vulnerable. The MiG was compact, swept-wing, and nearly supersonic in performance. When F-82 pilots saw flashes of silver descending from above, they understood the situation had changed. Aerial combat is unforgiving mathematics. If you are slower by 50 miles per hour, you are disadvantaged. If you are slower by 200, survival becomes unlikely. The straight-wing, propeller-driven twin Mustang could not match a jet fighter designed for speed. Air Force leadership acted without sentiment. They withdrew the F-82 from daylight operations in areas where MiGs operated. Sending it into so-called MiG alley during the day would have meant unacceptable losses. The piston-engine fighter era had effectively ended. The F-86 Sabre arrived to challenge the MiGs in direct jet combat. Speed against speed. The twin Mustang shifted roles. It became a night fighter. For the following year, the F-82 operated largely after dark. It patrolled cold skies over North Korea while jet combat unfolded during daylight. The MiGs lacked effective radar for night interception. The F-82 retained its radar pod. In darkness, it hunted supply trains and truck convoys that moved under cover of night. Drivers learned to fear the low rumble of twin engines above. Headlights off, believing themselves hidden, they would suddenly face rockets and machine gun fire from an unseen attacker. But aircraft, like crews, eventually wear down. The twin Mustangs in Korea accumulated flight hours beyond intended limits. Airframes fatigued. Replacement parts became scarce because production had ended years earlier. By 1951, the fleet was deteriorating. The Air Force began introducing jet-powered night fighters, such as the F-94 Starfire. It was complex and not elegant, but it represented the future. The F-82 represented the past. Its retirement was not dramatic. There were no ceremonies. Aircraft were ferried back to rear bases in Japan and then returned to the United States. They did not receive parades. They were dismantled. Engines and guns were removed. Airframes were cut apart for scrap. In the atomic age, there was no place for a twin-fuselage propeller fighter. The metal that had defended the Pusan Perimeter was melted down and repurposed. The pilots transitioned to jet aircraft or left military service, but the machines that carried them through those early months did not survive. In the atomic age, there was no room for sentiment toward a piston-driven fighter. The remaining airframes were towed into storage yards, their radar pods removed, their distinctive shapes dismantled piece by piece. The aluminum that once shielded soldiers and civilians became scrap. The F-82 did not gradually disappear. It was deliberately removed from relevance. Over time, it became little more than an odd entry in aviation history. A strange twin-bodied aircraft that enthusiasts debated. A design that seemed improbable. Most accounts of the Korean War air campaign focus on jet combat, on the clashes between Sabres and MiGs, on the dramatic emergence of the jet age. They overlook the transition. The twin Mustang served as that transition. It was the link between two eras. Technological progress is rarely smooth. The shift from propeller-driven fighters to jets was abrupt and hazardous. Early jets possessed speed but lacked range and durability. They represented the future, yet they were not fully prepared for the realities of that moment. The F-82 filled that gap. It was heavy, unconventional, and dependable. It carried the Air Force across vast Pacific distances when newer technology could not. Without it, the evacuation from Kimpo might have ended in disaster. Without it, armored columns could have broken through at Pusan. It provided time. It sustained defensive lines during the first critical months while the United States mobilized fully. It functioned as the steady presence that ensured others could operate. Today, only a few twin Mustangs remain. Most are preserved in museums, silent and immobile. Up close, the aircraft appears large and unusual. The central wing spans wide overhead. The two cockpits sit apart yet connected. On the ground, it seems cumbersome. Yet with imagination, its presence becomes clearer. The paired engines once produced a deep, synchronized rhythm that carried across valleys and coastlines. It was not the piercing sound of a jet. It was a steady, mechanical pulse. The aircraft represented the final expression of the piston fighter. These accounts are preserved to prevent that role from being forgotten. History often highlights the fastest or most advanced machines. There is a tendency to celebrate innovation while overlooking the tools that bridge difficult transitions. The F-82 demonstrates that technological advancement alone is not always sufficient. In some circumstances, endurance and practicality matter more than novelty. There are moments when speed is secondary to reliability. In those moments, the unconventional design that others question becomes indispensable. When the Korean War is examined carefully, it is not solely a narrative of jet fighters. It is also the story of an unusual twin-fuselage aircraft that held the line during a vulnerable transition, sustaining operations one long mission at a time.